All right, good morning and welcome to Sifting Through the Rubble, the third of our sessions on the curriculum at Memorial Lutheran School. These sessions serve to identify a classical approach to curriculum, first of all, secondly, a classical Lutheran approach, and then an explanatory way of working through the different subjects, which is a normal way for us of speaking about these things. But the language we used in the previous two, which were last month, end up being more appropriate, even though they use terms we're not used to using. So I want to review. There are 5 ends. The Greek word is telos, 5 teloi, or points, a 5-fold point to an education here at Memorial Lutheran School. The 5-fold end is 1, that our students be wise unto salvation. 2, that they have a masterful command of language, that being spoken and written language, English and Latin, mathematical language, and musical language. 3, that they be well-rounded and lifelong students, using the etymological definition, that is the root word definition of student, meaning an eager learner, so that they be well-rounded, that is, that they be a generalist and not a specialist, and lifelong, meaning that love of education and of learning is something that doesn't stop when they no longer have to go to school, but rather is something that encapsulates how they approach knowledge. So a student is wise unto salvation, possesses a masterful command of language, is a well-rounded and lifelong student, that is an eager learner, who can discern with sound reason, all for the purpose, number 5, of vocation, that is the life of love toward the neighbor, in whatever vocation a person may find themselves. The table of duties in the Catechism breaks it into sort of 3 estates: church, government, and family, which includes business, at least in Luther's idea. So you have preachers and hearers, that is pastors and Christians who hear the word, and then government and citizens, and then husband, wife, father, mother, children, employer, employee, orphans, widows, etc. So those are sort of the 3 general categories of vocation that we wish to prepare all of our students here for. So that's the 5-fold end of the curriculum. The last time we met, we talked about the principles, meaning those things that get us towards the ends, towards the 5-fold end. And the principles are faith, the arts, the sciences, and love. We used Latin words. We used fides, artes, scientiae, and caritas. Now, faith and love are, to a certain extent, self-explanatory. Faith is cultivated by the teaching of the Catechism and daily chapel, by the teaching of the Bible and the singing of hymns. We use another word for this. We call it catechesis. That is the Christian instruction and training of the youth, and certainly of adults too. Adult catechism or adult catechesis exists just as youth does. The arts includes a number of things that not everyone in the modern sense of the word art understands it to mean. So when we talk about arts, we mean the categories of liberal arts and fine arts. The category of liberal arts historically includes 2 subcategories, which are the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium are the language arts, and the quadrivium are the mathematical arts. How our modern subjects fit under the arts is a little different, but these are the historic terms that have been used to describe the liberal arts. Now, If that's confusing, then this term sciences or scientiae also will be confusing. The 21st century really only knows a couple of definitions for science, either hard science or soft science or social science, but not knowledge in general. The term scientia meant knowledge in Latin, not just so-called scientific knowledge. So we fit many things under this. Sorry, I'm looking at my chart here. So the three major categories that we went over last time were the studia humanitatis, meaning the humanities, mathematical reasoning, and lastly, but not least, the gymnastic, which goes more towards biology, health, PE, as a field of knowledge, taking care of the body. And then caritas is love, and this is the forming of the soul through literature, history, and theology. So those are the principles. Today we're going to dive into the so-called subjects. I say so-called because we're very used to subjects in American education. We ask the question, I even do it on tours, what is your favorite subject? But subject can be very divisive, and which isn't necessarily helpful, especially at the younger levels of a classical education. To a certain extent, you can't avoid it because we need to divide out our time and how we spend our time and what we spend our time on. On the other hand, though, we can take advantage of the fact that there is a tension between the old way of thinking about knowledge and a newer way of thinking about knowledge. The older way is universal, that knowledge is one thing with lots of different pieces, as opposed to knowledge being many, many different pieces, but not being one thing. Let me see if I can explain that a little clearer. I'm going to clear off the... So there's a way of looking at knowledge that either it is one large body of members, let's use it that way, a body of members that are interconnected and interrelated. Then you can, the other way of looking at knowledge, instead of universal, we'll make up a word, it's sort of multiversal, and that is that it is many and various individual parts one can connect, but the connections are not necessarily natural. The universal way of looking at knowledge is one that was common to humanity prior to the Enlightenment. The multiversal way of looking at knowledge comes as a result of the Enlightenment and rational thinking and modernism, the modern way of dividing everything out into tiny little itty-bitty parts. We use words like atoms, elements, cells. These terms are terms that we use as people who have been raised in the modern world to think about how things can or cannot relate one to another. And we tend to divide everything out. In the ancient and the medieval world, they had ways of dividing things out. They used genus and species, but they saw them as one thing that you were categorizing, as opposed to many, 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 many different things that you were categorizing, not because they belong to one thing, but because you need a way of talking about the many things. And our way of looking at education here at Memorial is more akin to the older way of doing things than to the newer way, but it's very hard to, especially let's say after 5th grade, right? We have to go to math class, then we have to go to history, we have to go to English. Having specialized teachers requires you to do some dividing. So how do we approach the dividing, and how do we approach the subjects? There's an easy way of doing this, and that is what you see on the report card. Right, that's a normal way for parents, for teachers, for students to understand what the subjects are that they are taking. You look on your report card and you see that you have a grade in math, you have a grade in history, you have a grade in religion, you may have a grade in memory work, in reading or literature and spelling, etc. That is a way of looking at subjects. In the lower grades, K to 5th, because they are predominantly in one class the whole day, things are a little bit more seamless, where you don't have the division from one subject to the next. You'll transition. There'll be more time that you can spend on a certain lesson in a particular day, because as the classroom teacher of the one class, you have flexibility. So there's the practical way of how the knowledge and the lessons can be seamless without division, even though you may be following a schedule. Another way that the seamlessness can come into existence is when the curriculum is tied together. And we see this actually in some of the upper grades instead of the lower grades, where literature and history reflect each other. Maybe not exactly all the time, but they're connected. Or where if the religion lesson is on Noah's Ark, and we happen to be going over baptism in the memory work, that would be a way in which knowledge is being looked at as universal and interconnected. Many curriculum that exist in public school, and one of the examples from my own past would be in college, when they had these writing across the curriculum ideas, where they would try to tie subjects together. This is really interesting because people realize that subjects go together, that writing and reading and history and theology and that philosophy, all of them are interconnected. You could just study one text, so to speak, and do all of the subjects. People realize that they're interconnected, but instead of starting with they are interconnected and now I will teach them, they start with the individual pieces that they have and then have to figure out how to reconnect them, even though the subjects were always connected in the first place. So in kindergarten through 5th grade, the things which we cover, which you could call subjects, would include phonics, which gives way to spelling. And perhaps we can lump in here handwriting, since that's a necessary thing towards phonics and spelling. Then we have English grammar, which begins as English jingles and then turns into actually analyzing sentences. We have literature or reading as we're gaining fluency. And then we have composition, writing, which is done in many of the subjects, but also becomes its own thing third on up. One can add into this an emphasis on read-alouds, which is not a subject that you would find on your report card, but it is a part of the day that we try and focus on here, especially in the elementary years. Picking good books for our children to hear read out loud. Then, of course, there's math, and we use Saxon to teach mathematics. We have history and not social studies. I don't know if I've explained the difference between the two here, but we can either do it later if anyone's interested, or we can save it for next week. And one can add to this geography, which is a work in progress for us systematically, but still an important part of knowing the world around us. Science is taught in K to 5th. Latin begins at first on up, although we've looked at little ways of including it into kindergarten, mostly through just listening to the CDs and songs that we have. Then we have religion, memory work, math, history, science, Latin, religion, and then one would add all of the arts and music, the PE and the library. You see, it's a lot of things to fit into a day, and part of the problem with the issue of subjects is that this seems so divisive, and think about how many things you have to accomplish in a day. So the nice thing about kindergarten through 5th grade is that much of it is seamless. You can go from one thing to the other. 5th graders tend to pull their spelling words out of their literature, and their literature is tied to their history. The more we can guide our students to see that the things are interconnected, that they're not just discrete parts, but that all of these subjects are actually representative of human knowledge and what children should be knowing as they grow up, the better I think we are doing at giving them a realistic understanding of the way that knowledge works. There's studies that have shown that liberal arts majors end up making better employees because they know how to think and how to think through things instead of just specifically knowing a task, specifically being specialized to one field or another. And even at the kindergarten through 5th, and one could even go further below to preschool and pre-K, by showing what we knew in kindergarten, that the subjects were all interconnected, taught by one teacher, given to us in a one grand package, that this helps breed an appropriate amount of generalization. Now, when we get 6 to 12, then things get a little trickier. They get trickier because most of us are used to not having one teacher or another. We're used to having many teachers when it comes to 6 through 12. We could, in 5th grade, maybe things were split up in your youth, but in 3rd or 4th, you had one teacher who taught you everything, maybe not PE and music, if you went to a private or public school, unless you were homeschooled. But you were used to maybe one person being the conduit for knowledge. In 6th through 12th grade, it's a little trickier. It's certainly possible, but most teachers are not trained to know all the math, English, history, science, language, grammar, literature texts that they would need to know in order to successfully teach everything from 6th through 12th grade. Generally, secondary education in America is made to be specialized. You specialize in math, you specialize in history, you specialize in science or in ELA, and that begins to split out a person's interest. Everybody has their own predilections, their own favorite subject. But when they have lots of teachers teaching them lots of subjects, it's a whole lot easier to pick. Either your least favorite, because that's that teacher I can't stand or who didn't do a very good job explaining it to me, or your most favorite because you loved the teacher and what they taught you, even if it wasn't on the subject, or you loved the way they handled one particular subject. When we get up here, we have, of course, Latin, we have English grammar interwoven with literature and composition, as well as spelling. We don't get rid of spelling. Handwriting is no longer a subject, so to speak, but handwriting is still cared for and cultivated in the upper grades. We introduce things like speech and debate and logic, which go towards the logic and rhetoric of the old trivium. We still, of course, have mathematics. We have science. And generally the natural sciences, although physical sciences are included too. We have history, of which geography is still a part. We have our PE and our art and our music and instrumental music, which begins in 5th grade. So not just theory, but also playing. Library falls out, but books are everywhere. So you have humane letters or English for 6th through 8th. You have history, you have science, you have math, you have speech and debate and logic, you have Latin, and you have religion, which turns into theology by 9th through 12th grade. Now, one sees here that, as when I've been talking to our high school students and prospective high school students, there's not a whole lot of room for electives, which many of us are used to having at one time or another, whether it's because we remember them from college or we went to a school, a high school, secondary school, that permitted us to have them. One of the reasons why electives are sparse is because our goal is to create jacks of all trades, generalists. As the children have the general knowledge, then they can apply it to their elective or specialized fields, should they choose to join one. But the general knowledge allows them to be better equipped to handle any task as opposed to one particular task. Right? Our goal is a well-rounded student who can think through things instead of a specific sort of tool-minded student who only exists to be a square-headed or a star-headed screwdriver. Our goal is more of a multi-tool approach to education. So that's the still pretty broad strokes with regards to curriculum, but a little more specific, looking at how we inculcate knowledge through the subjects, so to speak, in order to guide students to be inclined to the good, true, and beautiful, all for the fivefold purpose of education, that one is wise unto salvation, having a masterful command of language, being a well-rounded and lifelong student who can discern with sound reason for the purpose of love toward the neighbor. After that whirlwind, what sort of questions or rabbit holes does that provide for? We've got about 5 minutes left. I'd be happy to answer questions or talk on a distinction, whether it's history and social studies, or why Latin, or what about this? The floor is yours for those who are here today. No? Sleepy morning? Nothing at all? Well, I'll talk about history and social studies then, since I mentioned it twice. No one took the bait, and we still have 5 minutes. So there's a number of ways you can learn about the history versus social studies debate. But it really begins in the early 20th century in America, and late 19th, with the rise of immigrants, specifically from Asia, from Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, Southern Europe, as a result of all the turmoil that happens after the Revolution of 1848. There's a big wave of immigrants in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And American educators are concerned about, and schools, you can see this in the education journals, they're concerned about civics and knowing how the government operates. And they also are tired of the stereotype of the history teacher who just rattles off dates and times and is very stuffy and just sort of lectures from the front of the room. And they imagine, based upon the experience of any number of students, that history is boring and inaccessible and not good for children, but that social studies, there's also at this time the rise of psychology, the rise of sociology, the different soft sciences, so to speak, or social sciences rather. The social sciences are rising, and so social studies becomes a way to condense all of those things into one subject, really for the purpose of equipping and training citizens. Not that we're against civics or citizens, but what happens is you're not really training the moral imagination anymore. You've turned history into something pragmatic, merely for the purpose of daily living, and you've lost the training of the soul. And so to bring history back, again, is not to say civics don't count, or we shouldn't pay attention to elections or government participation or being a citizen, but rather that the study of the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians of the Middle Ages, of American history, of European history, and of the other continents too, once one has a good foundation in the Western civilization, is all for the purpose of training the moral imagination, of cultivating virtue, of guiding students to shun vice, and to realize that no matter what age they're studying, or what people for that matter, the study of history is the study of humanity. It allows a student, in whatever grade, to see humanity, the humanity that he or she is living, in someone else who may be different based upon the time they live in, or the language that they speak, or the situation particularly, but isn't actually different because they're still a human. They still have the same desires, the same faults, the same strengths, and history then allows you to learn about what it means to be a human in relationship to other humans, as opposed to just learning dates and facts for the purpose of being a citizen. And so that's one of probably the biggest reason why it's important to reclaim history and to eliminate social studies from the curriculum, so that students can be guided not only towards really interesting stories, because history generally is narrative, it's a story of humanity, but also to be guided towards virtue and away from vice, to see the connections between the observer of history and all of the people and events of the past. All right, any questions? Anything that comes up from this discussion of curriculum? Me droning on over here. Anything at all? Nothing. Okay, well, that's fine. Hopefully you appreciated the overview of the curriculum, of walking through the different pieces that we have here. If you have any questions at all, send them to me so we can talk about them next week in the last Sifting Through the Rubble for the first semester, where we'll do sort of a viewer's choice, going through some questions all about the school. I'll have some questions already prepared, but if anyone has any or knows someone who has some, please send them to me, and I'd be happy to talk through them and discuss through them. Thanks. Glad to do it. Hope you all have a lovely Friday and a blessed weekend.